So thanks a lot for the question. To start with, I would like to say something about the background information about China's labor market. So the Chinese labor market is quite different, from the other countries in the sense that the labor market is highly regulated with the household registration system. So in Chinese, we call the hukou system, which segregated the labor market into the urban and the rural sectors. So a typical resident was registered with the hukou type at birth. So urban or rural, agricultural and non-agricultural hukou types, largely based on their birthplace or the occupations of their parents. So this hukou type is just like an internal passport that is closely related to welfare system like education, medical care, etc. So this imposes strong barriers that makes it very difficult for labor migration across regions. And migrant workers are also discriminated in the labor market. So before the 1990s, rural to urban, agriculture to non-agricultural migration was strictly prohibited by this system. So since the late 1990s, the central government started to, carried out some reforms trying to relax, these hukou restrictions. For example, in 1997, there was a pilot reform in small towns and cities, and in 2001, some local government expanded this reform to the whole prefectural region, trying to further encourage labor movement from rural to urban areas. And in 2014, the central government issued a guideline for further relaxing hukou restrictions. And since then, many provinces, almost all provinces actually, had taken some actions to reform the system. So basically, different provinces and regions taking different measures or actions. But in some, there are two types of reforms. So the first type of reform is called unified hukou reform. That is the distinction between rural and urban hukou type is abolished, and everyone is registered with the same hukou type. So this means that everyone now has the same internal passport for the region. And the second type is called entry conditions reform. This entry conditions is just like a visa. So you need to satisfy some requirement and apply for a visa to enter the urban area and get a citizenship there. So basically, if one has a fixed legal residence and has a stable income source and can apply for a local hukou. So basically, this reduced the entry barriers a lot, because before this was controlled by a quota, and nowadays, particularly in recent years after 2014, so many cities, even some capital cities, further reduced the entry barriers, trying to attract talents. And in recent years, basically, you will see some media report, on the media saying that some cities, even capital cities, allow for immediate obtaining a local hukou without any barriers, particularly for college graduates. So we can see that basically the labor market in China has been more flexible, particularly compared to the 1990s, 1980s. Okay, and of course there are many other reforms in the labor market, like the minimum wage reform in 2004 and the new labor law in 2008. Okay, and if we look at the statistics, we see that the registered unemployed rates show a very clear decreasing trend since the 2000. So of course the calculation of unemployment rates is also sometimes controversial. But what we can see is that basically the Chinese labor market has become more flexible, and migrant workers are less discriminated, and also the workers' benefits are better protected. Well, thanks for the question. So we have a project studying the impacts of trade liberalization on gender employment inequality in China. So actually what we find is very interesting. So according to the population census, the average employment rate actually declined quite a lot from almost 90% in 1990 to around 70% in 2005. And the employment rates reduction is even more for females than male workers. This means that the gender employment gap is widening across time. So we are thinking maybe, of course, there are many different reasons behind the widening gender gap, but we are thinking maybe the changes in labor demand due to trade liberalization, trade openness could be one reason. So what we do is to link prefectural regional level employment by gender to exposure to tariff reductions between 1990 and 2005. And we find that actually regions with a larger reduction in tariff rates observe a smaller reduction in employment rates, and they kept more female workers than male workers in the workforce. What does this mean? This means that basically in those regions, the gender employment gap was not widening but becomes smaller. So in other words, again, against the large background that China experienced a reduction in employment rates and widening gender gap across time. So our findings basically indicates that without trade liberalization, the gender gap and the reduction in employment rates will be even larger. So we conclude that basically the trade liberalization is beneficial for China in terms of employment and narrowing the gender gap. Yeah, thanks. So we know that China joined the WTO in 2001, and since then, both imports and export increased tremendously. And in 2009, China even became the largest exporter of merchandise products. And in 2019, China basically contributed to 12% of the world total trade. And between 2001 and 2019, the total trade in China basically increased by 8 times. That's a lot. So nowadays, in the more and more globalized world, I believe that countries are better and better connected. And I believe that all countries play important roles in the international trade system. And China also becomes more important. So one example is that during this COVID-19 global pandemic, China plays a very important role in the world supply for medical equipment. For example, according to the United Nations trade statistics, we see that China basically exported like 14% of the world face masks in 2018, and whereas the second export, like Germany, exported only 7%, and the United States exported like 6%. So we see that basically China plays a quite important role in the international trade system. However, we also see that the role that China played is also changing across time. So we know that China is abundant in cheap labor and has a comparative advantage in producing the labor-intensive products. So China basically exported large amount of labor-intensive products, including textile and clothing, and some processing and assembling products. Okay? And so China is sort of labeled as the world factory in the past, but it's not anymore currently, nowadays actually. So basically the Chinese government has taken actions to promote technology upgrading, and we already see a change in the composition of Chinese exported products. So for example, in 2000, China exported around 33% of machinery and equipment, but this share increased to 49% in 2019. So there's a large increase, and we can see that China basically gradually changes its role in the world trade system and export more capital-intensive products, I would see. So there's also some discussions, for example, whether India will replace China and it will become the new world factory. We don't know, but what we can observe is that basically, the labor costs are rising a lot in recent years, and China is not anymore a country with cheap labor. So many multinational firms relocate their foreign plants to other Southeastern Asian countries like Cambodia and Vietnam. And we see that, well, basically China plays an important role, I would see, and at the same time, the role is changing across time. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think everyone knows that the COVID-19 crisis was so unexpected. It was outbroke in China in January and spread quickly in February. So the Chinese government basically imposed a very strict lockdown strategy, first in Wuhan city in late January, and then expanded to other regions in February. It has been proved that this strict lockdown strategy is very effective, and the crisis was already under control in late March, and the lockdown as a policy was also ended in many regions in late March. So basically, one can really imagine that this crisis affect the whole society very much. So during the lockdown, all shops, restaurants, public transportations, everything was shut down. The economy, the whole economy was shut down. Basically, people lost their jobs. So we don't have access. We don't have access to the data of employment by sector. But what we can imagine that there must be some heterogeneous effects across sectors. For example, the manufacturing industries, some service sectors like hotels, restaurants, and tourism are affected much more stronger. Particularly, those working in small firms and those working in the informal sector. I mean, those without formal contract and those self-employed individuals are more negatively affected. However, actually, according to the statistics of the National Bureau of Statistics, the overall employment in the first quarter of 2020 was generally stable. That was surprising, actually. The one potential explanation would be that actually in March, production in China in many regions have been recovered just back to almost normal and even expanded. Okay, so we don't have accession to the production data, but we do have a project studying China's exports, particularly exports for medical equipment in the first 4 months of 2020. So we can use export data to proxy for production. So what we can see is that basically the China's export in the first 2 months, January and February, dropped by 16% compared to the same months of last year. So this basically suggests there is a very strong negative shock to the economy, to the production, right? And this share actually reduced to like 3.5% in March, and in April, exports even increased by 8%, again compared to the same time of last year. So we see that the Chinese economy is gradually recovering, but we should not be too optimistic because this is only from the export side. If you look at the import side, it shows a completely different picture. So China's import dropped by around 10% in April compared to last April, and even more in May. So this means that basically the Chinese economy is closely related to the world economy, and we should be well prepared for economic slowdown in the next half of the year or even in the next few years, because the crisis is still going on in many other countries, and we should be well prepared for that.